watching the video. I started recording a little bit earlier, so you can probably skip ahead about 6 to 7 minutes, because that's when we should get started.
Morning.
All right.
So,
Yeah, do what you gotta do. It should be recorded, so you should be able to catch up on everything you miss.
Thank you so much.
It's green, right?
Huh?
Green?
Yes, sorry.
That's right. Grace, correct? Both Graces. Okay. First name and last name. No, both first Graces, I'm sorry. One of my other courses, I have another Grace, but it's last name. So. With Grace this semester. We have Morrison, correct? Okay. Morning. Hallway, right? Ellis? Let me guess, sorry. Long weekend, I forgot everybody's faces. What's your last name?
Morning.
Oh, that's right. Thank you. So I skipped over your name on the list. I feel like I saw your name. It sparked a memory. Okay, we've got about a minute left, I guess I'll officially do attendance. Aki is not here. Lounge is not here. Boggs is here. Bonner is here. Clay, not here. Clayton, not here. Dawson, is not here. Ellis is not here. Paula is here. Tyler is here. Harrison is here. Henson is here. James is here. Kesterson is here. King is not here. Lewis is not here. Lindeque, not here. Morrison is here. Grace is here. Bryce, not here. Ward is here. Wilcox is not here. Wilder, not here. Parks, not here. Oh, that was, man, right on cue. Turned at 8 o'clock right after I said that. It goes slow. Hopefully some people show up. It's been a rough Labor Day weekend. We've lost a lot of people. They're still on the roster, so unless they lost, I don't mean they dropped the class. They didn't go off on some kind of wild Labor Day adventure and not come back. All right, let's get started slowly, because I'm hoping this, what I'm about to remind you one last time is really important. So I'm hoping all these people who come in late will get to hear it. So first, we'll do the attendance word. The first word for attendance is Mo, like one of the Three Stooges, Larry, Curly, and Mo, M-O-E. We like the burrito place, Mo's. So Mo is the first word for attendance. We'll do the same thing I've been doing recently. So if you're online, not you guys, if you're watching the video, instead of just sending me the word Mo, send me the word Mo, and then also look up some picture that represents Mo. A few things. You don't even need to explain if you don't want to, but anyway, yeah, so Mo is the first attendance word. The rest of you, as usual, you can send me these attendance words in an email when we're done. And Wilcox, right?
Yes.
All right. Anyway, I want to remind you about pre-lab due dates. They're so important because you need to be prepared for the lab before you come to lab. And I know I mentioned every time we've met, whether it be in lab or in lecture, I keep reminding you of the lab due dates. One of the last things I told you on Friday, I said, hey, don't forget, your pre-lab for next week is due today. I even said, if you find yourself in a position where you're short on time and you haven't turned in the lab that we just did, and also you've got a pre-lab coming up and they're both due today, I said, prioritize the pre-lab, right? So not only have I told you a lot, but I've also given you this. Wait, also, let me back up too. If you're on the Facebook group, I've also reminded you there of these due dates. At the beginning of the semester, I shared this document with you. Said this is a list of every single due date. And it gives some notes. So if you look right here, the due date for pre-lab 2 is Friday, 8:30. And then in bold, it says, hey, by the way, there's 2 videos you have to watch and some questions you have to answer before you do the pre-lab, right? So it was right there. Then if you were to click it, because I have it set up this way, where are we at? When you click the link, it takes you to the lab, right? Click that. And then as you're scrolling down, you can see right here, well, it's kind of hard to see, but it's highlighted. So it's highlighted, and then you can't see it, but there's a comment that says, hey, make sure you don't skip this. And then right here in bold, it says, make sure you do these questions before you do the rest of the lab, otherwise you get 0 credit. I didn't fulfill that 0 credit threat, so to speak, but I did give you half credit if you didn't do those first. Next time, it's just gonna be 0 credit, which means you can't come to lab. Likewise, there's at least 2 or 3 of you, maybe not in this room, but on the roster, who still haven't done those. So you turned in your lab, I left a comment, said, hey, do those questions, reply to this comment when you're done so I know to grade it, and it hasn't happened. So if you haven't turned in the pre-lab yet, you can't come to lab this week. That's the bad news. The good news is, this is the first time I'm doing this, so I'm not gonna be sticking to the syllabus and saying you're getting 0 credit. If you can't come to lab today because you didn't do your pre-lab, send me an email and I'll have some things you can do to get, I said partial credit, but let's do full credit. I'll go ahead and tell you what you're gonna do right now to get your full credit for the lab. You're gonna do this whole lab, even though you're not coming to lab, you're gonna do the whole lab. So you're gonna need to get with your classmates, someone's need to get you the data for the pH stuff. Make sense? Or I'll also, if I can remember, I'll take a picture and I'll show you the data, share the data with you, and you need to do it. Now granted, you're on your own, right? So you might be like, oh, that's hard. But you're not on your own. I'm still here to help you. I'm just not gonna let you come in the lab today. So when you're doing those questions, if you want, you can meet me online and we can do the lab together. That's part 1. The other part is that extra credit lab. That's the online version of this lab. You're gonna need to do that lab too. So you do both of those labs combined, and then you can get full credit for this week's lab that you didn't attend. That make sense? All right. Starting next week, if you don't get the pre-lab in by Friday, you can't come to lab. It's important, right? I want you to know what you're doing before you come into lab. And by you turning in on Friday, that gives me all weekend if I feel like checking some emails, and then gives me Monday and Tuesday to check your pre-labs and let you know that, oh, you got that wrong, so let's make sure you understand what you're doing before you come in. Yes, ma'am?
If you did a pre-lab this month,
Not yet. Now, some people were able to because I left comments and said, hey, make sure you let me know, do these first and let me know when you're done. Some people did that, some people haven't done it yet. It's Wednesday, so it's too late. But again, if you're worried about your grade, don't worry about it this week. You just have to jump a few extra hoops, do a little bit of extra work, and you can still get full credit. And I guess for some people you might even enjoy it because now you don't have to come to lab. So for some people it might be a reward. Yes, sir.
Where is the link to watch these videos that you're recording?
That is, thing. Did I put it in the, let me see if it's here. If it's not here, I'll email it to you. Yeah. I really wish it didn't look so weird like this. Come on, announcements. Oh yeah, I think I know where it is. I'll try to make it easier. I'll post this link again for you because I won't say it's hidden, but let's see, list of every due date, late work for extra credit. So if you look under extra credit, I think that's there. Maybe. Yeah, I don't want to take up time. That's a great question. So even if it is already up there, I'm still going to find another way. I'm going to post it again and make it very obvious for you. Good question. Yeah, there's a whole document that has all the list of all of our lectures and also all of my previous lectures. So you can watch those previous lectures and get extra credit for that. All kinds of extra credit. Any other questions? All right. And also, the one last thing I'll say is, please check your emails often. That was another thing I said for sure. Because a lot of you, had you checked your email often, then when I sent you that email, I told you that you couldn't come to lab. Hey, you got to get this done before you come to lab. I did that a while ago. So if you check your emails regularly, you would have seen that email and you could have taken care of it. So please check your emails regularly. Please check your announcements regularly. I guess that's it. Any other or any questions? All right. Don't don't like to get the week started on a negative note, but it's important stuff, so I had to say it. Let me share this really quickly. Anybody have a bad work weekend? Do you think worth sharing? Any horror stories from the long weekend? That's good. Any good stories from this weekend? Yeah. No news is good news, I guess. All right, got that up there. All right. So this is pretty much where we left off. This was the last part. We were talking about acids and bases and pH. And when I was asking you, like, how many of you have ever had a soda or coffee or lemon juice or lime juice or all these things are really acidic? And I said, how many of you died? And none of you raised your hand, right? Because none of you have died from that. And the point I was making is because our body has things called buffers inside of them. And buffers resist a change in pH. They're really, really important. Your book talks a lot about them. How do they work? And I might ask you this on the exam. You definitely need to know what a buffer is. A buffer is something that resists a change in pH. You might need to know these two things. Basically, a buffer just does the opposite of what's being done to it. Right? So if you're adding a bunch of acid to it, it's going to accept those hydrogen protons or hydrogen ions. If you add a bunch of base to it, it's going to give off some of those hydrogen ions. Right? It does the opposite of what's happening to it. Does it make sense? All right. And a buffer, this might come up a little bit later in the semester too, so it's kind of important. Definitely the concept of acids and bases is pretty important. If there's no questions to that, let's go to the next big section. Yes, ma'am. Question?
Yeah, I got a question about, like, I put that a base removes hydroxide from the solution. If it receives hydrogen, does it not remove hydroxide?
Hydroxide is OH minus, right?
Yeah.
So a base doesn't do that. A base puts in OH minus into a solution.
So I know that it says accepts hydrogen ions by releasing hydroxide ions as well.
A base, yes, accepts the hydrogen ions, the H plus, by putting out OH minus. Is that what you have down there?
By releasing, yeah.
Yes, that's what a base does, is release that, okay,
So
so,
it doesn't mean the same thing as removes OH, it puts in OH, that's what that statement means, we just read.
I'll go back. Okay, so, let's see where we at here. Donate one H, okay, so when you add a base, right, it's going to donate the H plus, because the H plus is the opposite of the base, right? You should think of H plus as an acid. So when you add acid to it, when you add a base to it, it's basically adding an acid to it. When you add an acid to it, it basically does the opposite and accepts the H plus. It's always the opposite. You put in an acid, and what's an acid do? Sounds like you've got good notes here. Tell me, what does an acid give us? A solution. What does an acid put out? Good. So if you put in an acid, it's going to accept those H pluses. Meanwhile, and it sounds like you got good notes and you understand this, a base, let's forget about the OH for a second. A base accepts what?
H plus.
Good. The base accepts H plus. So if you put in a base, instead of accepting the H plus, it's going to give out the H plus. Because we're talking about a buffer. A buffer is neither an acid nor a base. It can kind of act as both. It just does the opposite of what's happening to it. As a matter of fact, if you want to, if you can send me an email and remind me, I can update this PowerPoint and even reword this. Because when you think about it, I could write it like accepts H plus when in excess, or donates OH minus when the H plus is in excess. But I didn't want to make it too confusing. I just wanted to stick on the fact that a buffer does the opposite of what's done to it. So if you add an acid, it's going to do the opposite of what that acid is. If you add a base, it's going to do the opposite of that.
So acid and bases are more so about how much H plus and not about removing OH minus.
Sure. In this way of explaining it. So if you remember last time we talked about it, and when I showed that pH scale, and I was like, all right, when we're saying something is acidic, there are so many different ways we could say the same thing. Like, this is more acidic than this. Another way you could say that is this is less basic than this. And another way of you could say that is this has more H plus than this, or this has less OH minus than this. So there's all these different ways. I can see why it's confusing. But don't let it stress you, because I hope I said this last time we brought it up. If there's any questions, it'll be like one question, maybe two. So if you find yourself like, oh my God, I don't think I can get this, definitely come to my help. Get my help because I want you to understand it. But as far as your grade is concerned, it's not a big deal. Plus, hopefully in lab today, you get familiar with these concepts. Yes, sir.
In the term pH, does the H stand for hydrogen?
Look that up for independent work. Seriously. I don't even want to answer that question because it's one of those things where there's not a consensus to what it means. And if I got into it mathematically, the P is it's a mathematical term. It basically means the inverse of the logarithm. So you can see why I didn't want to get into that. Yeah. Great question, though, I guess, out of curiosity. But more importantly, to address this question, what you need to know is you don't need to know. So just know that when we say pH, we just mean it's a scale to talk about how acidic or basic something is. Great question. And you can look it up for independent work if you want. Oh, which reminds me, because you've been doing a lot of those. I don't know if you guys saw this announcement, but for independent work, obviously you're supposed to write a Google Doc and submit it to me that way. But I thought of another easy way to keep things simple. If you're just answering one simple question like that, you can just email it to me and you just get 1 point, right? So I'm not worried about how long it is. I'm not even worried about you plagiarizing. Because if you just use like one sentence, I wanted to know what pH stands for according to this source, and then you can just copy it verbatim and answer it, and boom, you got a point. Does that make sense? Now, if you start reading into it, you're like, oh, this is actually pretty complicated. You want to write a paper about it, you're going to want to submit that to me via Google Docs, because the longer it is, the more points you get. But if you just want to answer a question and get a point, just email it. Don't worry about Google Docs. Make sure you have a source still. Don't worry about plagiarizing. Just to stay in the habit, I would try to use quotation marks if you are directly quoting, but I'm not going to be that big. So thank you for that question and reminding me of that. Any other questions? After this, we're done. We're done with acids and bases. Moving to the last portion of chapter 2, which is probably impossible to read, but it's biological molecules. The last third. And this is probably also going to be impossible to read, but I'll read it for you. The learning objectives. I can't even read that right there. I have to read it on the screen. The first one is, you should be able to describe the ways in which carbon is critical to life. We talked about that. You should be able to explain the impact of slight changes in an amino acid on organisms. That might be blowing your mind. You might be like, well, what the hell is an amino acid? You're about to find out. You should be able to describe the 4 major types of biological molecules. That's the big one. A lot of the test is going to be a part of that. Like, I'll describe one of the 4, and based on that description, you should be like, oh yeah, it's this one or that one. And then finally, you should understand the functions of the 4 major types of molecules. But here we go. We'll talk about that. The next word for attendance is Dayton, like Dayton, Ohio, for example. Dayton. Not that I would never not give you the points if you misspelled it. If you came in late, you're required to send me the attendance words because I won't know that you're here without doing that. So make sure you send me those attendance words. The rest of you can if you want to for a little bit more extra credit. Here's something you need to know because I told you in a previous slide. Cells are mostly made up of water. I don't expect anybody to have this memorized yet. Does anybody remember what that slide said? What percentage our cells are made of water? I love that because if you were to combine the two, you would be correct. 70 to 95% water. You do need to know that for the exam. So then, obviously, if our cells are mostly water, then let's take water away from the equation and let's pretend like we're looking at a cell where all the water is removed. So what's left? The rest of it is mostly carbon-based molecules. I'm not going to ask you that bullet point. This is more of an introduction as to like, why are we talking about this? Well, it's because all these carbon-based molecules I'm about to tell you about, make up most of your cell when you don't include water. So obviously they're important. And then next chapter, when we talk about how cells work, to truly understand how cells work, you kind of need to know how their main molecules work. And that's what this is. So why carbon? Not that I'm going to ask you this either, but again, this is an introduction. Carbon forms large, complex, and diverse molecules that are necessary for life. And again, we're going to talk about those different types of molecules. We're even on the next slide going to start talking about some specific properties of carbon. And all these things that we're going to talk about, they are called organic compounds or macromolecules. Right? In this course, we use those terms interchangeably. These are carbon-based molecules. Big old question mark here. I'll do 2 question marks, indicating I'm almost definitely not going to ask you the definition of an organic compound or a macromolecule. But if you do, just think carbon-based. So when you think organic, at least in this course, you probably have to get your head out of what you've learned your whole life. Usually when people talk about organic, they're talking about the marketing scheme. You know, oh, this was grown organically. This is different, right? When we're talking about organic, we're talking about carbon-based. At least that's how this course looks like. Any questions about this slide before we start talking about carbon? All right, as you're going to be very aware of by the end of this lab, carbon makes 4 covalent bonds. I might ask you that. I don't know, probably not. Put a question mark. And besides, you'll see, once you draw all those molecules, you'll probably be very sick of it, and there'll probably be no way that between now and when you take the exam, you'll forget that carbon makes 4 molecules, or carbon makes 4 bonds, because you'll draw so many of them. But that's only 4 bonds, right? So a big deal. But those 4 bonds are more than any other element that we talk about in this course, right? So oxygen only makes 2, hydrogen only makes 1, nitrogen only makes 3, right? The rest of them we don't even talk about. So the big 4, remember from the previous lecture, the big 4, of those big 4, this one has the most bonds, 4 bonds. And because it can make 4 bonds, it has a varying size, varying branch patterns, and varying, and I'll show you some examples of that. But I will also put it next to that. I'm not going to ask you if carbon makes varying sizes or varying branch patterns. This is just to help you understand why carbon is so essential. So here's some examples from the old textbook. So you definitely don't need to know these examples. Notice they're not even named. They have names, but the old textbook didn't even provide a name because the name's not important. But here's a great example. So this is a nice square-looking molecule. This one's kind of like a rectangle molecule, but doesn't have things sticking out here. This one's more of honestly, a phallic molecule, right? With that shape to it. Maybe my head's in the gutter. And here, this one's made of ring, right? How many of you are chemists? I know I've asked you this before, but just to be sure, no chemists in here? Okay. But one thing you can know about chemistry without even diving deep into chemistry is there's a relationship between the form and the function. So even not knowing anything about this, you can see these things are all different sizes and different shapes, right? Could you agree with that? Well, just knowing that, you don't even need to know what these things do, but just knowing that they have such different shape and different size means they have different functions. So once again, this is kind of why carbon is so important, because it can make all these different shapes and sizes. Thus, they can do all these different functions. And another thing I say before I move forward, not that you need to know this is good to keep in the back of your mind. And this is really basic chemistry in a way, and I don't think enough chemistry teachers talk about this. A lot of time, chemical reactions are how molecules fit together, right? And you guys have all had kindergarten. You've had to deal with puzzles and putting the blocks in the holes and that kind of stuff, right? Things fit together differently. Look at these things. And you can imagine if I had a molecule that was shaped like this, I could probably maybe slide it in there, right? Or if I had a molecule that was straight, maybe I could slide it in there. You just picture all the different ways that you could fit molecules together. Yes, ma'am?
I just need to say that loud to make sure this makes sense. Carbon usually uses one of those bonds to bond with itself, and that's why it can make so many things, because the other one also has, the other 3 bonds that it's bonded with. Does that make sense what I'm saying?
I think so. And if I'm understanding you correctly, then you're interpreting this correctly, this picture. But this isn't always the case. Carbon doesn't always bond to itself. Sometimes it's always bonded to something else. That's a great question. For example, carbon monoxide, that's a carbon bonded to one oxygen. It's a great question. So when you're studying this, and I'm so glad you asked, again, this is just an example. Don't look too deep into this. This is just 4 of billions, I don't know about billions, but millions of different molecules that are out there with carbon in them. So don't necessarily think that they always bond to another carbon or that,
It's not like, more attracted to any specific ones, it literally will take anything it can get.
as far as we're concerned, in case anyone else is wondering, no, I won't even say that. As far as we're concerned, yes. Because then you start getting into organic chemistry, and then it has a lot to do with the size and the shape and even the electronegativity of the molecules, and it gets pretty complicated. When we talk about things like mechanisms, like in organic chemistry, you don't just talk about, okay, this molecule meets with this molecule and it results in this molecule. Then you're talking about like, all right, this molecule's nucleus attacks this molecule's electrons, and it gets really complicated. So don't read too much into this. The one thing I would say to take from this is that carbon can bond 4 times and make a lot of different shapes and sizes. That's really the most important thing. And as you'll see, you'll get practice with that in the exam. All right, any other questions about that one? So, also to your point, carbon can bond with so many elements. But most commonly, as far as we're concerned in this class, the only ones we're normally concerned with, there'll be a few exceptions, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. So in other words, the big 4, right? Any questions about that? That's old news. I'm just reminding you again, you do need to know the big 4, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen. All right, one more example of a carbon molecule. This one's the most basic of the carbon molecules, methane. Put a big old X through this before I start talking about it, just to indicate I'm not going to ask you any questions about methane. There might be some in the study guide, I don't remember, or the quizzes, I don't remember, but not on the exam. So, but let's talk about it very quickly anyway. So you can see this carbon in the middle, and it's got 4 different hydrogens bonded to it. It's one of the most simple organic compounds. It's abundant in natural gas, and it's usually basically produced by bacteria, whether the bacteria be in places like swamps, and swamp gas, that's what that is, or the digestive tracts of grazing animals. So that's why cows fart so much. They don't actually break down that grass they eat. They've got things inside their stomachs to do it, and the byproduct is methane. Anyway, I'm not going to test you on that, it's just an example. Likewise, this is just 4 different ways of drawing methane. Structural formula, ball and stick model, space filling model. Once again, I'm not going to ask you any questions about that. Structural formula, you'll get very familiar with that in lab today. Anyway, that's it for methane. Any questions about methane, which is relatively unimportant in the context of this course. All right, so that's just carbon itself. Let's just talk about larger molecules in general. Larger organic compounds. So again, we're talking about larger ones. And because they're organic, we're talking about carbon compounds. The old textbook, and I don't remember if your textbook does it, but I left it in here anyway because it's a good comparison. I'm not going to ask you about this, but it's a great comparison. Large organic compounds are the main molecules found in gasoline, right? That's what octane looks like. That's a large organic compound. It is 8 carbons and a bunch of hydrogens. But larger organic compounds are also the fuels in your body. So not just the fuels for your vehicles, but also the fuels for your body. Like this example, this is what dietary fat looks like. And once again, there's this relationship between structure and function. So even though you guys aren't chemists, you could look at this and look at this and be like, that dietary fat kind of looks like 3 octanes put together. And it's not exactly, it is similar. And they kind of act the same way. The same way we break down gasoline to release energy is the same way our bodies break down dietary fat to release energy. Anyway, just an example. Again, this is leading up to the stuff that you actually need to know. So none of this will be on the exam. Any questions about this slide? All right. Here's some drawings. So all those 2 things, octane versus dietary fat, let's see what they look like. Those are up, right? There's octane at the top, and there's one of the 3 from the dietary fat, right? Again, you can see how similar they are. And again, this is just an example, so don't be concentrating on the COOH or the difference between octane and saturated fat. This is just an example. Once again, I'm trying to show you that you can see they are similar. I mean, usually when things have similar forms, they have similar functions. Again, just an example. Any questions about that example? All right. So again, they have some, I keep saying these 2 have similar functions, right? So another thing that's very important to think about is depending on the type of molecule we're talking about, it has very unique properties, right? So for example, even though I haven't taught you yet, you could probably imagine a dietary fat is probably very different than a protein, right? Probably very different than a hormone, right? All these things I'm about to teach you, it has different properties. And those different properties depend basically on the shape, like all the stuff I've been telling you, which is what these 2 bullet points come together to say. Depends on the carbon skeleton and the things that are attached to that skeleton, which is another way of saying the shape, right? The unique properties of all these things I'm about to teach you are all dependent on the shape. Is what you should know. It does get a little deeper than that. I will give a few exceptions to the rule. But yeah, but for the most part, for this course, this 100 level non-major biology course, you can just think, all right, it's all about the shape. So what are these atoms that are attached to the skeletons? These are called functional groups. I'm probably not going to ask you what a functional group is, but I'm definitely going to talk about them throughout this chapter, through the rest of the chapter. So I just want you to know what I mean when I say, oh, this is a functional group. It's a group of atoms that are directly involved in the chemical reactions. Obviously, they're attached to the carbon skeleton because that's what we're talking about here, right? And each one of them plays a role in the chemical reactions. Many biologicals have 2 or more functional groups. And once again, I'm most definitely, or almost definitely, not going to ask you the definition of a functional group. I just want to give you, make sure you understand so you understand what I'm talking about when I use the word. Here's something you definitely don't need to know. This is not from your textbook. This is not from the old textbook, but I thought this was a great example. So here's some examples of some different functional groups. You even got the names: a hydroxyl group, a methyl group, carbonyl group, carboxyl group, amino group, phosphate group. All these groups are going to be used in some of these molecules I'm going to talk about in this portion of the chapter. And I'm not going to ask you about them. You definitely don't need to know the names of them. You definitely don't need to know their properties. But the reason I included this is because it goes back to what I said on that previous slide. It's all about the functional groups that dictate how these molecules act in chemical reactions. For example, what happens when you mix oil and water? Doesn't mix. Thank you. And if you, as usual, if you answer the question and you send me the extra credit words, remind me too that you answered the question so you get a little bit more extra credit. But yeah, they don't mix. Which I haven't taught you yet, but you're going to learn soon. Well, you know half of this. Water is polar, and oil is nonpolar, and that's why they don't mix. So again, imagine you have these carbon molecules. One of them's got some polar stuff hanging off the side of it. One of them's got some non-polar stuff hanging off the side of it. They're going to repel from each other, right? Because those things don't mix. Things that are charged, right? If something has a positive charge and something else has a negative charge, you can imagine they are going to mix. They're going to be attracted to each other. So these are all details that you don't need to know. I'm just saying in the back of your mind, just think about it. They have all these different shapes, all these different sizes, all these different charges, all these different, whether they're polar versus non-polar, and all these things affect what they do chemically. And you don't need to know specifically how each little thing makes a difference. Just keep in the back of your mind, there's a large variety of them, and will dictate how they act chemically. And sometimes when I say how they act chemically, try to think of things in a 3-dimensional space. Usually when you think of chemical reactions, you might just think of the equation written on the board, like this molecule plus this molecule, arrow, gives us this molecule. But in this chapter, really what you should be thinking, or this portion of the chapter, you shouldn't even be thinking about it like that. You should think, all right, this molecule attaches to this molecule in this way, and then that leads to you having a molecule with this shape, right? So you just think about how they come together. All right, so on a molecular scale, a lot of these macrobiological molecules that we're going to talk about are very huge, and we call them macromolecules. I would say there's no need to write this down, but your book included it, so did I. So I'll take a step back to remind you. Today, hopefully today, we're going to get through them all. We're going to talk about 4 categories of molecules. But your book is pointing out, so will I very briefly, that technically only 3 of them are considered macromolecules. So the carbs are macromolecules. The proteins are macromolecules. Nucleic acids are macromolecules. The other 4th category, which are fats, those are not technically macromolecules, but I'm not going to ask you that. So I'll just put a big old X through here. I don't care that you know which ones are macromolecules and which ones aren't. But hopefully you're studying your textbook, so I wanted to say this. That way when you get to that portion of your textbook, you don't think, wait a minute, he didn't say that. So I'm saying it now, but I'm also telling you, excuse me, you don't need to know that. Any questions about that slide? All right, this is probably one of the more important slides that I'll show you today, because it has a lot of information that you do need to know for the exam. Macromolecules are made up of something called polymers. Polymers are made by stringing together monomers. So you need to know that. Polymers are made up of monomers. Not only is that important to know that tidbit of information, but like I said earlier, for the exam, when it comes to these 4 categories of molecules, I'm going to describe them, and then based on the description, you're going to be like, oh, okay, that's a nucleic acid, or that's a carbohydrate, or that's a protein, whatever it may be, right? And one of the ways I'm going to describe them, one of the ways you need to differentiate one type of molecule from the other is this. They're all going to have different monomers and different polymers. And I don't expect you to know this yet. I'm about to teach it to you officially again in a few slides. But for an example, carbohydrates are made up of monosaccharides. So the monomer is the monosaccharide. The polymer is called a polysaccharide, right? So in the exam, I might say, which of the 4 molecules is made up of monosaccharides to make polysaccharides? So then again, you need to know the monomer's name and the polymer's name. So that's why, as far as the exam is concerned, these terms are important. It's not going to be using that to help you differentiate between the different types of molecules. Any questions about that bullet point? All right, another thing you need to know, and you'll have at least one question about this on the exam. You need to know what a dehydration reaction is. And basically, you could just, if you were making flashcards, you could put dehydration reaction on one side and then links together on the other. You can just remember links what together. When you're putting 2 molecules together, it's called a dehydration reaction. Yeah, it's going to be 2 monomers, but whatever. I just want you to think, when I'm bringing molecules together, as far as we're concerned in this class, it's always a dehydration reaction. The reason it has that name is because of this bullet point here. And I'm not necessarily going to ask you that question. Which one removes the water, removes a molecule of water? Dehydration reaction or the other one? Right? I'm not going to ask you that. But I might describe a reaction, and the 2 ways you're going to know that is a dehydration reaction is 1, 2 things are going to be coming together, not splitting apart, and 2, it's going to remove a water molecule as opposed to adding one. So hence the name dehydration reaction. The next slide, I'm going to show you an example. Are there any questions before I get to that? I like this drawing. So remember I was talking about carbohydrates? This is a good example. I know it looks like a cartoon, but really these are individual sugars, monosaccharides, right? And they're all linked together to make a polymer. Some other examples, non-biology examples, you could think of train. The whole train would be a polymer. Each individual train car would be the monomer. A pearl necklace. The whole necklace would be the polymer. Each individual pearl would be the monomer. Make sense? All right, back to dehydration reactions. This is just an example. Again, only thing you need to know about dehydration reactions in this exam, in this course, is when you bring things together, like this thing and this thing, when you bring something together, that's called a dehydration reaction. Likewise, when you remove a water molecule from the products, from the reactants, it's called a dehydration reaction. Let me write this down too. First of all, let me point this out. In this particular example, we happen to be putting together a short polymer and a monomer. It doesn't always have to be that way. It could be a monomer and a monomer. It could be a short polymer and another short polymer. It could be a long polymer and a long polymer. It doesn't matter. It could be anything. As long as we're bringing 2 things together to make something that's bigger, that's called a dehydration reaction. And really quickly, to help you identify this without pictures, I'm just going to make up some molecule. Let's say you bring molecule A together with molecule B. So D,
chemical reaction. And that gives you the molecule AB plus water. So if I were to give you this equation, not the picture, if I were to give you that equation on the exam, you should recognize that as a dehydration reaction. How? Well, because we brought two things together, right? Those two were brought together. And also there's water on the right-hand side of the equation. Any questions about that?
Dehydration reaction is putting two molecules together and we split them apart.
Good question. That's called a hydrolysis reaction. Great question. And in this case, you need water. You have to use water to break them apart. Great question and great time. Now, this first bullet point is only to explain why that's even relevant to us. I'm not going to ask you this, but yeah, when you digest things, you're breaking down molecules, right? So when you're, when you're breaking down molecules, that's called a hydrolysis reaction. And it's just the opposite of everything we just talked about. So instead of bringing things together, it's breaking them apart. And then once again, I'll draw this. So if the reaction starts with a molecule of AB, and again, I'm just making something up, and the reaction breaks those apart, so now you're left with A and B, not just AB together, but A separated from B. Plus you had to use water to get it done. Oh, that looks horrible. That is a hydrolysis reaction. Water on the left-hand side of the equation, breaking something apart, that's a hydrolysis reaction. I hated this when I was a student because they sound too similar. Dehydration, hydrolysis, it's all about water. I don't know why my brain I just couldn't stick with it. I've screwed it up a lot. Even today, I probably do every once in a while because they sound too similar. So if it stresses you, don't feel bad because I'm telling you, that's normal. It sounds too similar. Another thing to know is there's only going to be like 1 or 2 questions about it on the exam. So again, low pressure. All right. Any questions about that slide? Or yes?
Your definition says break bonds between, is it possible that it would just break the bond of a big molecule and be?
Good question. And yeah. Yes. So there we go. I should update this. Yeah, breaks bonds between anything. Sort of like I was saying up here, like this particular example showed a short polymer and a monomer. This is a great question. Really, as far as we're concerned, if you break anything, we're calling that hydrolysis. Whether you're taking one monomer, breaking it apart, which we don't even really talk about much in this course, or whether you're taking a polymer and breaking it apart. So yes, thank you. Very great question. We're breaking it apart, as far as we're concerned in this course, it's called hydrolysis, whether it's a monomer or a polymer. Any other questions? All right, the next word, or I guess phrase for attendance. This will be interesting because if you're watching the video, not if you're online right now, but if you're watching the video later, remember you need to send a picture of these words too. So the next phrase is bean head. Two different, like bean, like a pinto bean or something, and head, the base head, thing on top of your shoulders. So with that introduction, now we can finally jump into 4 categories of large biological molecules. So again, this portion of the exam is mostly going to be concerned with you differentiating between these things. I'm going to describe one, and you're going to tell me which one it is. I might describe it by its monomers versus its polymers. I might describe it by its function. I might describe it by giving you some examples of particular carbs or lipids or proteins or nucleic acids. So keep that in the back of your mind as you're learning these different 4. That's going to be the main focus, is you determining which is which when given some examples. Or I shouldn't even say examples, when given some other information, whether it be examples or functions, or polymers and monomers. So any questions about that?
Is lipid cells, are they the one that causes the cancers and stuff?
No. And we will talk about that later in the semester. For now, once we get the lipids, the only thing you need to think about is basically fatty stuff.
Based.
So that's another good thing to point out too. These things are all molecules that make up the organelles, and organelles make up cells, right? So none of these are cells. All of these things make up cells, but none of them are cells. Now I won't even get into it. There are some cells that have a lot of lipids, for example, or proteins, but we won't even get into that. I chose these pictures. Does anybody know what this thing is over here? What is it?
The little bug that live on your face.
Actually, that's a great guess because they do look a lot like that. No, this is called I think a water bear. I forget the actual name of it. But as far as I know, that's the smallest animal on the planet. Anyway, does anybody know what this is? Not that you need to. One of these. Technically, that's one tree. Right? It looks like a bunch of trees, or excuse me, let me rephrase that. Obviously, it's different trees. Technically, that's one organism. So some people, like, if this is a good independent work topic, if you want to look into it, you could just leave me a one sentence answer, but this is a little bit more complicated, so it'd be probably more of a paper. But if you look up what's the largest organism on Earth, some people describe that. But it gets, there's some gray area. But anyway, my point being, no matter whether we're talking about the largest organism on Earth, whatever it may be, or the smallest animal on Earth, whatever it is, they're all made up of these four things. Right? This is why these four things are important. All things that are alive are made up of these four things. That's why we're learning about it. So the first one we're going to talk about, obviously, is carbohydrates. So what do you think? On this picture, I see three different things that we might put into our body, right? And which one of those do you think is a carbohydrate? Or which two of those? Or are they all three carbohydrates? We're looking at a bottle of water, which is for some reason a little bit hidden, a can of Coca-Cola, and a plate of pasta. What are those? Which of those is
The
carbohydrates?
pasta.
Good. And the Coke, good. That's tricky, right? Before I took any of these classes, when you talk to me about carbs, I'm thinking pasta. Like when you're going to run a 5K or a 10K or a half marathon or whatever, sometimes you'll carb overload beforehand, meaning you're going to need a lot of carbohydrates. But usually in that context, when people mean carbohydrates, they mean something like pasta. And we'll differentiate between the two. But first thing you need to know for this portion is what a carbohydrate is. So basically it's sugars and polymers of sugars. If you remember that, you're good that's a great example of what a carbohydrate is. Obviously, for example, that Coca-Cola has sugar in it, like most people think of sugar. That pasta, the starch in that pasta, the same sugar that's in that Coca-Cola, that's what the pasta is. It's just put together, a bunch of them put together. Which is interesting. Think about like the difference in taste between the sugar and the starch, right? It's the same molecule, but it has a different size and shape. Therefore, when it hits your tongue and sits in some other molecules that are on your tongue, it sends a different signal to your brain. Not that you need to know all that for the exam, but it's just, to me, fascinating how something made up of the same stuff can have such a widely different flavor just because of one's bigger than the other. Anyway, here's some examples. Well, no, I already told you about this. No need to write this down. We just talked about it. You've got the small sugars that are in soft drink. You've got the large starch molecules in the spaghetti. And the bread. I don't know why there's no bread there. Should be. Maybe it's off the picture. Anyway, any questions so far? So I'll split my royalty check with you. Coca-Cola pays me that. I'm just kidding. Oh, that reminds me. This is completely off the wall. I saw somebody who teaches another class at another university, and what they like to do is get pictures from their students and put them on their PowerPoints. So if you ever see anything on here, you're like, oh, I could give them a picture of that. And you want me to use it? Send me a picture. Use it. I give you the credit for it. Especially if it was something more interesting than bread or pasta, but whatever. Maybe you're really proud of the pasta you make, and you want me to include that picture instead of that one. Anyway, let's get back to it. Carbohydrates. Here's something you definitely need to know. Their function, right? I said that one of the things you need to know to differentiate between all the different types of biological molecules is their function. What do they do? In animals, carbohydrates are the primary source of dietary energy. Primary being the key word, right? It's not the only source. You get energy from eating fat. You get energy from eating protein. But their primary source of energy is carbohydrates. And that'll be really important a couple of chapters from now. In plants, it's also the primary source of dietary energy. Of course, I guess you might not say dietary because they don't eat in the traditional sense of eating, but they do use it for energy, and they use it for building material for much of the plant body. So when you look at a plant, I know it looks really green, and green is chlorophyll, we'll talk about that later, but that's just the color. When you stop thinking about the color, most of what you're looking at when you see a plant is carbohydrates. Whether it be the leaves, or the bark, or the roots, most of what you're looking at is carbohydrates. So are there any questions about their function in animals and plants? All right, to make things more complicated for you, again, carbohydrates is one of the 4 types of molecules we're going to talk about, and I'm going to make it more complicated. When we come back on Friday, we're going to talk about different subcategories of carbohydrates, and you're going to need to know the difference between those subcategories, and you're going to need to remember, obviously, that those subcategories all fall under the umbrella of carbohydrates. Let's see. The last word for attendance will be another name. Let's do Dustin. That's it. So remember, if you can't come to lab today, send me an email, or most likely I've already emailed you, reply to it. We're going to get you that full grade. You just can't come to lab. And again, for some of you, that might be a reward because you don't have to come to lab today. Yeah, anyway, if anybody has questions, send me an email or visit me on office hours to talk about it. Don't forget, if you came in late, send me an email to tell me you came in late. You'll either get half credit, or if you send me the words that I've been saying, you get part of it. Last name? No, we always have last name. What's your last name? Yeah, send me an email. You can't come to that if you didn't do the last name Clayton. Let me double check right here. Might as well. Now, this is, when I pull up, when you share it with me, I have access to it. I have nothing yet to turn it in. If you want, you can come to office hours or meet me online for office hours, so I can show you, walk you through the steps of how to share it with me, how to turn it in, because that might be the issue. You might have thought to turn it in, but didn't know how, maybe. Because there's been a lot of problem people who have that issue, is like, how to turn it in, so it's not just you. Shoot, I should remind everybody, yeah, it will. Because we're gonna be dealing with acids and bases. I should remind everybody, oh well. I'll send it off into Google or some kind of message. Which one? Which email? I mean, what was it about? I'm sorry. Oh, yes, everybody who has, no, I'm just letting them know. What's your last name? Oh, yeah, okay. Okay, well, then yeah, you should be good. You should be good. Let me see what's up with that. Did you do the quiz?
What quiz?
And this quiz is due every Sunday. And I sent a reminder too.
No.
That's the issue. Because, think about it, there's only, like you said, there's only been 2 things due. I mean, not including the pre-lab, because that didn't even it's your grade. So yeah, that's what it is. So you're in a really good position. Just imagine if you only had 2 assignments that I'm basing your whole grade off of, one of them's missing or bad, that's gonna look horrible because there's only 2 assignments. But in the grand scheme of the semester, it'll be okay.
Every Sunday.
Every 2 Sundays. But if you go, like I was showing, were you here when we started? Well, if you go to WVSU Online and look at the announcements, there's a link that says every due date for the semester. You click on that and it'll show you the day, the date, and sometimes even like little notes, like for this pre-lab, with a little note say, hey, make sure you watch the video. So you click on there, it'll help you, and you should still be able to do it.
So from like now on, if I like, make sure I do my quizzing on time, I'll be fine.
Yeah, I mean, yeah,
Okay. Thank you.
that should have been something else I announced.
So I do on the, I don't have.
What I'll do, again, since this is the second lab, and the first time you actually needed pants, anybody who doesn't have pants, stay in the back of the classroom while I do the experiment in front of the classroom, and you have to look from a distance. And then when I'm done with the experiment, I'll let students do it themselves if they want. You just obviously won't be able to do that because you don't have protective gear. For this week, as far as attendance and grades are concerned, you're unaffected. Thank you for all the great questions. That really helps.
I'm sorry, I feel like I'm confusing.
No, I love it. No, not at all. And it proves to me you're paying attention. So if anybody's just like glazing over that, if they're just glazing over that PowerPoint slide, then that would have been an easy thing to miss. You're like, wait a minute, is it just monomers that hydrolysis reactions break up? So, thank you. I appreciate the questions.
Way too confused not to ask.
You're welcome.